Florio. I'm the CEO of Desert Harvest. Thank you for joining us today. Today we have Dr. Justin Garcia, the Executive Director of the Kinsey Institute with us. Hi, Justin.
Hi, Heather. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Definitely. So we kind of wanted to introduce and get everybody to know a little bit more about the Kinsey Institute, the kind of the whole goals of today, talk about the research that you do. Let's start by telling everybody about the Kinsey Institute, the mission, how it was founded. Start with the basics.
Sure. And thanks again. I'm delighted to be here, be able to share some of the stories about the Kinsey Institute, and grateful for wonderful partners like you and Desert Harvest. So the Kinsey Institute was founded in 1947 at the time as a separate non-for-profit at Indiana University in Bloomington. And the history of the Institute is actually Dr. Alfred C. Kinsey, who was a zoologist, was quite well known for studying gall wasps in his career as a small insect, and was a taxonomist, really obsessively studied them to understand their variation and diversity. And he applied that same kind of obsessive technique to people's sexual lives. It started because he was team teaching a course here at IU on it was called the marriage course. You had to be married, you had to be 21. It was the sexual hygiene course in the 1930s. And he team taught that in 1938, 1939. And in some ways, the very best of what can happen at a university. There were so many questions from students. Kinsey said, we have to do research. There's no answers to these questions the students have. So from there, he embarked, starting as soon as 1940, embarked on to this day, the most impressive and ambitious sexological study. They interviewed 18,000 people. Interviews lasted 3 to 18 hours, often over multiple days. And all of those interviews were then culminated many years later in 1947 into creating what was then called the Institute for Sex Research. That was initially the two blockbuster books were Dr. Kinsey's Sexual Behavior of the Human Male in 1948, a year later, and Sexual Behavior of the Human Female in 1953, 5 years after that. The second book was much more interesting. We'll get back to that. And so the Institute today looks a little bit different. It's now named after our founder, so it's the Kinsey Institute for Sex Research. And we cover a whole lot of different areas. It's actually three wings of the Institute. So our main research program, we have 9 research centers and laboratories within the Institute. We have a group that works on sexual violence, the Sexual Assault Research Initiative. We have a group, my own research program is on people's romantic and sexual lives. We have a group that works on condom use and misuse for over 25 years, basic questions about use and misuse. And I love some of their work. Questions even like if you do a big public health survey and you ask someone if they used a condom during their last sexual event. Well, it turns out a lot of people will say yes, but then you ask, did you start your sexual event with a condom? And a bunch say no. And they go, did you finish your sexual event with a condom? And a lot say no. So even the way we ask questions about sex and sexuality in our intimate lives can give us different answers. So that's one wing of the Institute. The other wing is our education program, which you, Heather, and Desert Harvest have been supportive of and helped us really amplify the messages that we want to make accessible to the world. So that we have a lecture series. So we have speakers from all over. We have some awards annually that we give. We have a PhD minor here at IU in human sexuality. We have a program with the medical school, the IU School of Medicine, on human sexuality and health. Some people don't know. We often think physicians can be a good place to go for questions around our sexual lives. And there are some that are so talented and focused on issues of sexual and reproductive health. But most physicians get, at least in North America, they get about 1 hour of training on human sexuality. 1 hour, 30 minutes on male anatomy and 30 minutes on female anatomy and sexual dysfunction. Really, how do we change that? How do we make it so that physicians have content and knowledge and comfort to ask those questions and help patients?
Yeah, that actually amazed me recently because I was meeting with an OBGYN. They deliver babies.
Yeah.
And she said she got the same training in sexual health. That's all she got originally. And so she had to go and do it herself and afterwards because she didn't have the training in medical school as an OBGYN who delivers babies.
Yeah. And I think so much of your work too, you see like where people will go there as a source for advice, but they just don't necessarily have that. And I Remember the last time we were together, we were talking about this article in the Journal of Sexual Medicine. Only 40% of gynecologists ask their patients about their sex lives.
Yeah.
So it's just not even coming up. So where are your sources for accurate information? And that's really where we've been committed to building out the Kinsey Institute's education programs, to be a place that people can get scientifically accurate information. And then our third wing is the Kinsey Institute Library and Special Collections. I still remember your favorite piece. And we have the Library and Special Collections at the Institute are the world's largest research collection of materials on human sexuality. So spanning over 2,000 years of human history from all over the globe. There's millions of items in our collection. And it's a destination research collection. So scholars come from other institutes and often will spend time here diving into archives. And what's so interesting about what we have in our holdings, and we have fine art and photography and artifacts and manuscripts and archives, is that for many people, it was a place where things could be safe. So at a time that maybe you didn't know where you could have materials about sexuality or your own archives, or if you were an institution. And the Kinsey collections have really been a place that historically, for 77 years now, that materials have been safe for people to know that they could be here, they could be archived, they could be accessible. So that's something we're really proud, a legacy that we're proud to continue and make it available to people. So those are the sort of three big parts of what the Institute is today.
Yeah, it is, the mission and what you do with, bringing that is why we at Desert Harvest love to partner with the Kinsey Institute so much, because our goals align with that ability to educate and of course that warehouse and that archives with all those amazing things that is my dream place. And you have to tell about you have these boxes that you don't even know what are in them, right?
Yeah, we have some collections that are that come from all over. So some of the collections are things that it just takes a while to get through them. Sometimes we'll get a large amount of materials and try to understand what's there and how we make it accessible. How we preserve it also is really important. The right temperature, the right environment, the right packaging, the right kind of glass for artwork that's displayed. But sometimes we get materials that are sealed for a while. So particularly if they're things related to medical care, sometimes we have certain files that are sealed. So we know they're there, and there's a date at which the box gets opened, and the constant treasures are available. So our head of collections, Liana Joe, who's a treasure to the field, both to us here and to the
Yes.
field of sexology. As you know, Liana adores you and
Amazing.
really holds these secrets. And I think a place that people knew materials were safe. And sometimes it's because the materials are erotic, and other times it's because there's some aspect of the story of why it's at Kinsey. It tells something about, let's say, gender and women's lives, or it tells us something about sexuality. I think often of the Emilio Sanchez collection we have. And Sanchez's works are in almost every major museum, his architectural drawings, but only two collections have his more personal, his intimate drawings. That's the Kinsey Institute and the New York Public Library. And our curator, Rebecca Fassman, had a spectacular exhibition of these more intimate stories about sort of a gay Cuban artist and his history and what was commissioned versus what wasn't. The pieces everyone wanted that the Postal Service made a stamp for were the architectural drawings, but these other aspects of his life tell such an interesting story.
That's beautiful. And now you're adding a little bit of your own to these archives here soon, right? Your own book. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. I'd be delighted. I'm really excited for this. So mostly what we do a lot of academic articles at the Institute. We've across all the 9 labs, we publish about 100 academic articles, really more than anywhere else in this space, trying to contribute to our knowledge base. My own personal work is on people's romantic and sexual lives. And I'm really excited. Next year, my next book will be out. It's called The Intimate Animal. It'll be published by Knopf in the US and Penguin in the UK. And what I really work on in that book is the tensions between love and sex. And one of the things I've always been interested in as a biologist, by training, I'm an evolutionary biologist, is that biologists don't use the term monogamy. And what we talk about is social monogamy and sexual monogamy. There's 2 types. And social monogamy is what we might call romantic love, intense pair bonds, close connections. In other animals, we would describe it as mutual territory defense and cooperative breeding of offspring. And that's the relationship. That's the bond that we form. And humans are somewhat unique. Only 3% of mammals do that. 15% of primates, so our primate cousins, a little more likely. And but that's different from sexual monogamy, which is sexual fidelity. And many species who form those intense bonds aren't always sexually exclusive. So what I do in the intimate animal is I look at the tensions between love and sex, between social and sexual monogamy, at all different aspects of relationships: singlehood, starting a relationship, courtship, maintaining a relationship, breakups. Not that everyone has breakups, but breakups and finding it again. Most people do, but and finding it again. So it's been a really fun and for me, it's been a real interesting. I think so much of this space. I'm curious what you think of this too, Heather. Is so much of this space is so personal to so many of us. And something I've never really done though is I'm generally a private person. I don't really talk about my personal life. So in this book, I've tried to use my own experiences, sort of fumbling through the science over these last 15 years of, and use a little bit of my own story of how I found these questions and how they've challenged me personally. So that's also been an adventure. Hopefully people won't be too sick of me by the end of the book.
I think we all do that as as academics. You really want to keep your writing to the science, to academic and scientific writing. But when you start to write a book, like when I did with Ingrid Hernandez with the musculoskeletal mystery, it's very easy to put a sense of yourself in there when you start writing and you start engaging and creating almost thought-provoking questions to ask your audience, and then you start asking yourself, and it's like light bulb for yourself almost that you want to share. And I think it almost creates a connection between you and the reader. Whereas we can read sometimes these scientific and academic papers that everybody else would be like, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think for the work that we do at Kinsey, at Desert Harvest, it's there's a vulnerable aspect of it, of thinking about our bodies, our sensuality, our sexuality, exploring, finding what works and doesn't. And I think we owe it to ourselves and to each other to say, even as scientists and as researchers, we stumble through some of those questions ourselves and find we're all looking for answers. We're all in that journey together of looking for healthy, happy answers.
Yeah. Finding what suits us best and maybe feeling comfortable with yourself or
Yeah.
maybe your kinks and things like that. Feeling comfortable and connected to yourself and your own sexuality
Yeah.
is so important. So speaking of that, one of the things I loved at the Institute, and of course is online and in the book, is the Kinsey scale. I should have put up a picture of this. Can you describe this a little bit to me? Because I think it was very applicable and is very mind blowing to some people.
Yeah. It was one of the great interventions of Dr. Kinsey and his colleagues in the first volume, in the 48 book, Sexual Behavior of the Human Male, was what's often called the Kinsey scale. And what that was an idea that sexual orientation went on a continuum they used 0 to 6. And in their scale, it was exclusively heterosexual, predominantly heterosexual, incidentally heterosexual, bisexual, incidentally homosexual, predominantly homosexual. And so it's sort of sliding scale. And actually, I think it came out of Dr. Kinsey's background as a zoologist, because in the natural world, most traits vary. Most traits happen on a continuum. I think it's always interesting when people raise questions about sexuality and gender and nature. And it's like the natural world is all about variation and diversity. It was Charles Darwin's ingredient for his theory of evolution, was that traits vary quite a bit. So what Kinsey and colleagues observed was that people had this variation in their sexual orientation. As taxonomists, what he was trying to do is say, let's understand that as a scale. Now, what's interesting about that is that in the original study, people didn't ask to self-identify. Today, we think a lot about sexual identities. We might ask people, where are you on a scale from 0 to 6? Where do you identify? Kinsey and colleagues were actually interested in their behavior. So they said, how many male sexual partners, how many female sexual partners, how many male sexual fantasies, how many female sexual fantasies, and they were assigned a score. So today we think a lot differently but we still carry that forward, but we've built on that to think of it differently. So that's the classic Kinsey scale, the 0 to 6. And today we'll often ask people not just we might ask you, what's your identity on 0 to 6? What's your behavior, 0 to 6, your preference? Because researchers today often will separate sexual identity, or do you identify as straight, gay, bi, asexual, versus your behaviors, versus your preferences. And we have a better understanding, I think, than in the past, that behaviors don't always align with orientation. Sometimes people are heteroflexible, or they maybe are more experimental at some points of life in their sexual orientation. Sometimes in college, sometimes after retirement. So at different points in our life, we can test the boundaries. But that doesn't necessarily question our identity. You might say, hey, I'm straight, or hey, I'm a lesbian, but I occasionally engage in these behaviors that don't totally align with that orientation. But not every behavior has to define your identity. So I think we have a much richer understanding. But Kinsey got us started, that initial kernel, to say, hey, we got to think about the diversity of people's experiences and identities. They don't cleanly fit in boxes. It was such an important truth that he made available to us.
It is, and it will, throughout the lifetime of the, as we go through this, it's really interesting to think that, Dr. Kinsey started off as a zoologist. You started off as an evolutionary biologist, and now, you're studying human sex, and I guess, for you it's very an evolutionary change that you're watching through. But we go from the animal world to the human world, and kind of taking this in, that this scale really gives us a place to kind of evolutionary, our own evolution, how we're evolving through life, and that through that scale we might be at different levels throughout our lifetime.
Yeah, and I think that is such an amazing change that years ago necessarily people didn't understand, that where we are in terms of our sexuality and our gender, but actually sexuality a little bit more, that can change at different points in our life, and for different reasons. Sometimes it's because of fear or shame, and then we come to a point that we have more opportunity to acknowledge it. Maybe it's also just experience. You experience different things, and you say, hey, I didn't try that till I was 30, but I liked it. So that there's all sorts of interesting dynamics across our life course that shape who we are in terms of our sexuality. And sexuality is such a big part of our identity, our experience, our satisfaction, and our relationships with ourselves. And to recognize that and to honor it, and to honor that it's complex, I think is so important to our well-being.
Agreed. Okay, now very important question here. We talk about back to the warehouse of awesomeness, I'll call it. What is your favorite piece at the Institute?
Oh gosh, that's a hard one. There's millions of items. That's a hard one.
Let me put you on the spot.
I know. Oh, my favorite piece. We have a lot. I like some collections, and oh my gosh, if Rebecca's hearing me, she's gonna probably let's starting to rattle off some. We have some. Oh gosh, we have a collection of George Platt lines. I actually have some in my office that I just adore. George Platt lines, his use of light, of course. He was the photographer for the New York City Ballet, and his use of light. A lot of male nudes. The series I have in my office are ballet dancers, nude ballet dancers. But also, I'm looking because they're on that wall, and but also his use of light and inspired Mapplethorpe as well. I also, I'm a big fan of, I have it's one piece by Judy Dater, a woman photographer in our collection. I have a black and white image of one of her photos in my office that I think is, if I'm getting the date right, it was in the 1960s, that particular piece. And it's an embrace, of two people, and you can't really tell their race, and you can't really tell their gender. And I really love it because when people come in, they'll often stop and look at it. And it's just I'm looking at it now, the corner of my eye. And it's such a reminder of the power of intimacy and the power of human connection, and that it transcends clear racial and ethnic borders and boundaries and genders and age. And you can see these two bodies, but you can't quite make out the demographic details. And for me, it's just such a powerful message in the art. But we also have some Japanese woodblocks of sexual materials that I also love. Oh, I'm having a hard time. Now I'm starting to recall.
We're on a cascade now. We're like, I've got so many, you can't narrow it down. I completely understand. I was in awe when I was there myself. You know, my favorite piece, the last moment of no gender identity.
Yeah. In our gallery, that's in our current gallery exhibition of universal diversity on gender and sex that Rebecca put up, and it's a powerful piece.
Yeah, that was the most moving piece for me, definitely.
I'll add a fun one that's coming up, although it's not. We've told people about it, but they're not. We've just acquired the entire collection of the late great Cynthia Plaster-Caster. So we're excited for that exhibition and I think there's so many interesting stories about how. For those that don't know, Cynthia Plaster-Caster is well known for making penis molds of musicians and celebrities, and I think that's interesting. What's interesting about the Kinsey collections again is the molds, the penis molds of famous musicians. Have been displayed, but we have the complete archive. So the stories and her letters with these artists and photographs and like what inspired the work and what made people willing to have a mold of their penis made. I think it just tells this rich story in a way that's never been told. This is one project Rebecca's working on now. And I think that's what's so cool about the Kinsey Institute Library and Special Collections is the ability to tell a robust story about not just, and I shouldn't say but first of erotic materials in the world, but also the history and the story of how they came to be here, or how they came to be created. Again, sees that sort of fullness of people's lives, of the role of love and sex and intimacy and gender and reproduction in our lives.
Well, in a great time of sexual revolution in our history, it really documents it. Cynthia was like the consummate groupie who became this amazing artist, and I think even later in life she started doing women's breasts as well, right?
Yes, that's right.
So I'm so excited about this collection, and that Desert Harvest gets to be a part of it and bringing this story and this history that nobody's seen in totality. Like you said, the stories, the history that's in there.
And I think it's a great example of, for the Institute, we're a research institute, but where we have partnerships. That's why I so value, I value you as my friend, and we value Desert Harvest as a partner, because the Institute we all know this remarkable legacy of research with sort of the sort of wonderful minds, but how do we get those stories out? And where we have particularly industry and corporate partners and individual philanthropists have helped us make it accessible and make things, help with our accession of the materials, with the digitizing of them, making sure that they're stewarded, and then sharing it with the world. I can't wait. I know we have a plan. I can't wait. We'll share next year when we have that show on exhibition. So
yes, so excited about that. So let's now talk about part of why we are here, which is fundraising for the Kinsey Institute. So one of the things that we are currently doing is an auction. We have amazing items from Anne Fontaine against Stella McCartney, a purse, Danielle Ballou, dinner for two in his famous New York City restaurant. We have Nikki Green, her iconic green suit she's donated. Cesar Galindo is going to do a custom. Like, there are amazing things in this auction. But let's talk about why we are fundraising here a little bit. So I'll let you go fully into detail, but let's talk about what happened, unfortunately, earlier this year with the defunding of the Kinsey Institute by the Indiana legislature.
Sure, and thank you so much for the platform to be able to share that, and great to see so many friends joining. Hi Dale, hi Jessica. A good reminder as I'm about to share the sort of troubles we're in, that we've got friends and that we need them more than ever in our corner. And so the Institute, so as I said, was founded in 1947 and has often withstood attacks and for different reasons, and including attacks that were sometimes about why we existed or why we should exist in the first place. There have been times, for instance, that the government has tried to come after grants, research grants. We've had faculty that had grants on studying arousal, and the government tried to have those removed. We were really fortunate. The American Psychological Association and other groups helped stand up and defend the Institute at those times. And interestingly, you know, I know you know you think similarly as I do in these, that sometimes when groups say, well, should we be talking about sex in the first place? You think, you know, what do you think is the biggest predictor of divorce in America? You know, all the studies are very clear: sexual issues. You know, people always say money and family and the economy, and study after study shows sex. I mean, if we what's the biggest predictor of breast cancer survivorship? It's spousal support. What happens, you know, how do you maintain that relationship? Sex is a part of that. The interconnectedness of sex to our lives in so many ways. And we ignore that, or we hide that, or we put it in the closet, to borrow the pun, really at our peril, really at the loss of well-being and human dignity. And so what happened this year was the Indiana legislature, in a sort of surprise move, voted to prevent Indiana University from using state funds to support the Kinsey Institute. We actually didn't have state appropriations directly, but we do have funds from the university that help support the foundation, because we are a research institute tied to IU. A lot of our faculty have tenured appointments. We have laboratories. We have federal grants. So it was a significant blow. It was largely symbolic because of how we're funded. We didn't have state dollars. But it was a real challenge to sort of attacking the study of human sexuality and sexual diversity. We've been really fortunate. A number of organizations have stood up. Our own university, our provost has been wonderful and sort of outspoken in his defense of academic freedom here on campus. PEN America had a wonderful statement. FIRE had a strong statement. The World Association for Sexual Health had a strong statement. I think just the global reach of the Institute and a reminder at what's at stake when we try to prevent even asking questions around sexuality. The Kinsey Institute is not an advocacy organization. We never have been. What we do is we try and study aspects of human sexuality. And when that is what's under attack, just asking the questions, or a repository of scientific answers, I think we're in a really bad place as a society, a dangerous place. So our fundraising efforts over the last year, thanks to our colleague Natalie Kubat at the Kinsey Institute, our director of development, has really been helping us champion a longer sustainable future for the Institute. And that's been helpful through fundraising. So events, we've had gifts in kind, we've had artwork, we've had some folks are making gifts of cash. People are considering estate gifts, and several have made them. So working with us for long-term planning. But things like endowed chairs, things like financial gifts allow us to ask questions that are bold, and that are things that sometimes you can't get funded. We hear all the time when we write a federal grant, well, can you take sex out of the title? Can you take sex out of the abstract? You know, at some point it's like, we are a sex institute. We ask questions.
What are you, Facebook?
Yeah, exactly. No, well, that's sort of the shadow banning, as you know better than anyone, or what you've also had to contend with, the shadow banning on social media.
Yes.
Is really, or I think of my friend Dan Glock, the CEO of the Museum of Sex in New York City. They famously couldn't advertise in subways about this wonderful museum because it was the Museum of Sex. And so many of us in this space together have experienced these sorts of issues. But when a research institute is under attack, it's a new level of concerning. As I say, new level of depravity, but I'll just say a new level of concerning for the very right to ask those questions. So that's why we're here. We're really helping to generate support and rally the troops and allow us to keep asking those bold questions.
Perfect. Let's start first. The first thing I want to do before we talk any further about this is kind of head off the age-old myth, the one that constantly pops up regarding Kinsey's original research and child abuse and the claims that were made in the 80s by Dr. Judith Reisman and could you, enlighten, because that's one of the questions and one of the biggest pieces of misinformation that spreads on social media, and of course has been revived as a result of this.
Yeah, and I'm thankful for bringing it up. And it is one that we contend with a lot. And you can go online and you can find all this mythology about Dr. Kinsey and the Institute even today. In terms of, even us ourselves. I've been personally doxxed. I've had my home address listed. I've had we receive messages fairly often of attacks. Sometimes it's just about studying sexuality and gender. We know that people who study LGBTQ issues, people who are LGBTQ, are often called perverts and pedophiles, and that's sort of an age-old trope. Unfortunately, our staff and faculty receive that. But in this particular case, there's a kind of popular myth that Kinsey did experiments on babies, on sexual studies on babies. And it kind of gets recapitulated in this view, and it's used as an example of why we shouldn't have any sex education. And I want to tease those two apart and why they're so troubling. The one is there is no evidence that anyone did any studies on babies. Actually, Dr. Kinsey himself never did experiments. That wasn't his research methodology. But what did happen was in the male volume, Kinsey used a research method where he said, we're going to ask everyone questions, and we're going to take everything we learn, and we're going to put it back into the book and make it available to people. And they oversampled people who were sex workers, people who were in prison. So in their study, they did talk to people who did things that were illegal or did things that were problematic. That includes people who were pedophiles and had sexual events with children. So when they reported everything that they learned from everyone, that some people have used that to say, well, were the researchers doing experiments and sexually abusing children? It's like, not even close. In fact, if anyone bothered to look carefully at what Kinsey wrote, he was way ahead of his time in terms of issues of consent, respect for persons, for informed consent as a researcher, but also wrote a lot about thinking of sex as something that should be mutually pleasurable if it happens with a partner, but also that respects the participant you're having sex with. And so, but it's used as an example. It's a method we probably wouldn't use today. We would be much more cautious. We would be there are people, not here, but there are colleagues of ours in other places of the world that do study the science of pedophilia and try to understand what it is and the psychology of it, how to prevent it. How to prevent it from happening in the first place, how to prevent repeat offenses. You have to do research to understand that, to prevent it. Sometimes people have an emotional reaction. They go, well, just get rid of anyone who's ever done it. That's not going to prevent it. We have to study it to make sure that people are not harmed. And so, but that's also not the work we've ever done here. So it's that's also a piece of it. But what's happened is folks like the late Judith Reisman and others have used that to say, well, Kinsey unleashed the sexual revolution and with it moral decay on America. That might be a direct quote. And with it, I think the challenge is that it's framed in terms of being concerned about young people's sexual lives. And this particular contingent will say, well, don't talk about sex, because if you talk about sex, you're going to sexualize people and they're going to go and do it. And this idea that we're safer if we never talk about sex, that there shouldn't be sex ed in schools, there shouldn't be sex education in universities, there shouldn't be ban the books, burn them. And I think the challenge for us as researchers, as advocates, is that as educators, is when you look at the data tell a fairly clean story, that those people who have access to accurate information around sexuality, who feel comfort talking about it, you reduce the likelihood of unintended pregnancy. You reduce the likelihood of sexually transmitted infections, of domestic violence, of intimate partner violence, of emotional and mental health issues related to sexuality, of suicide related, particularly for those of sexual minorities. So I think this question of caution, right? And I agree. I totally sympathize when people say, well, I worry about the sexualization of youth. That's a perfectly reasonable worry. But if we really want young people to be healthy, we have to look at the data. The data tell a remarkably clean story. Those that experience comprehensive sex education, now that's not advocating to have sex, it's just telling people what the facts are. They have better health outcomes. So I think the challenge and the thing we need to ask these groups are, if you're serious about the well-being of youth, if you're serious about protecting youth from sexual violence, why on earth do you not support accurate sex education? That's the story of the data. And I think that's a question we really need to push back and ask folks.
Well, that leads into, like, what Tara's doing at the Youth Sexpert program.
Yeah.
These youth and crave this knowledge because they're not getting it from anywhere. They don't have any definitive, and even if you go to the internet, you're flooded with misinformation in a lot of cases, and three different people saying three different things on just, let's say, vulvar anatomy. And looking at that, you could see three different images if you Google that right now. And I think so that they want accurate information, and people like Tara, who with the Youth Sexpert program, where she's taking her figurative idea of Netflix, that shows sex education, and it's all like, we could educate this way. We could educate our own peers and become that definitive resource, creating content from sexperts around the world, those educators that can create this definitive, accurate content, and then educate youth that are join the program with their parents' permission, and then they can be the educators in their schools, because we can't seem to fix the broken system. And these youth do crave this knowledge because they're in the most hormonal phase of their entire lives, and they don't understand themselves, they don't understand their bodies, and they crave this knowledge.
Yeah, and I love that. I love Tara's program. I love that you've been so supportive. You've helped make it a reality, and it's we need that. We know we need that information. People just need accurate information, and it's so easy to go online and just be flooded with misinformation around sex and sexuality and gender and relationships, and that's dangerous. I mean, that's the thing that I think we all need to be pointing attention to. That you go online, you can find so much fake information and misinformation, purposeful misinformation, that's really dangerous for people's well-being. And we have a place to really try and educate. And we know that making people more comfortable to just ask questions, to think about their bodies and their sexuality is really so important. And sometimes that misinformation overshadows the real work. I mean, I think as you say, that's sort of the myths around the Institute. I can't tell you the number of times we've had, people call and leave an angry voicemail or show up. And I sometimes think to myself, we have one of the world's experts on sex, the psychology of sexual violence here, and another expert on the public health and sexual consent, and another expert on domestic violence. And what on earth do you think we're doing up there? We're making the world a more informed, healthier, safer place. And this idea, I mean, on its face, it's a little deranged. This idea that people would sit outside and say, well, let's not even talk about that. It's just that is such a dangerous position for anyone who really cares about the well-being of society.
Yeah, I mean, just here, I was just noticing in the chat, we have, and I think a question that is very relevant to this when we talk about educating our youth and educating. So we go to the power of social media, how it affects the body image most negatively, especially for young youth, young girls, young boys. And this question says this can lead to mental illness and in some cases suicide because their bodies don't meet the standards reflected on social media. How can Kinsey help with this vital problem? Did Dr. Kinsey discuss body image with his patients, and what conclusions did he find?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Kinsey had some, and the research team had some studies about people's feeling of themselves and how that impacted their sexuality in terms of their comfort. The original study is not so much on body image, but certainly in the years since. Actually, we just did a study on body image. One of our postdocs, Dr. Campbell, has worked on body image, and we just published a paper about body image and sexuality with our colleague Dave Frederick at Chapman fairly recently. In the journal Body Image. And that's exactly right, that we know, and so much of the information that people get from online or from social media can really be a distortion of who we think we are. There's been a lot of evidence that particularly young women are being disproportionately impacted by this. And researchers right now are having really intense debates around the methodology about trying to understand why is it that we see that depression of young people is on the rise, particularly of girls, so young women and girls is on the rise, and how we make sense of that. So we see that these negative mental health things are on the rise, but is there a way to curate this? Is there a way to make the information in a way that people aren't internalizing and saying, well, my body doesn't look like that. My sex life doesn't look like that. It's a phenomenon, particularly with our sex lives, it's a phenomenon that's called pluralistic ignorance. And it's this idea that we think everyone out there is having a great sex life. You're having more sex than me. You're having better sex than me. You're more intimately fulfilled than me. But in fact, if we were to take the time to talk to our friends and our colleagues about it, we're all by definition close to average, right? And that's really not what's happening. But we have this sense that out there it's better. Out there people have found something that's healthier and more enjoyable and more satisfying. And then we put ourselves in a position that we're competing with this fake ideal. And then particularly the Dale's brilliant question about body image is one that, we're competing with this goal that that can really be scary, particularly with things like you can start to impact diet, and it can impact sleep, which really impacts your sexual life. You can start using things that are dangerous. You've been such a great advocate of this, Heather. People like, not using products that are dangerous to their bodies because you just start looking for things. You start grabbing for straws, and rather than saying, okay, here's a way to do this with something that's healthy.
Yeah, I almost feel like in so many cases, it can be so much in our heads from a personal experience. Like the most, we all have that part of our body that we dislike, that we hate. And I think for me, a real realization is it's my husband's most favorite part of my body. And I'm like, why? But we create almost in our head this idea that we're less, or that we're less than something that we might see. Grass is greener on the other side. We always see something that we want. So I think that we need to focus more and more on being comfortable in our own bodies. And I think sexual health is a part of that. Like when you are having sex with a partner and you feel, that overwhelming feeling that you feel sexy and you feel wanted and you feel desired and you desire. And as a result, you become more and more and more comfortable in your own body, I'd say.
Yeah. That's so well said. I love it.
Okay, yay. So I think that other than, is there anything else that you want to add? I do see that we have a mention of where to find your book, and someone saw Jimi Hendrix's penis from Cynthia Plastercaster, the most iconic of them all.
That's the most iconic one. And then, Jessica mentioning that, yes, the museum in Iceland, the museum of the phallus, the penis museum. And which is great. There are these sort of a few cultural institutions, but not many that can really think about people's sexuality and sexual lives. My book will be available next year, and it was delayed a little bit, but it'll be out next year. So it's up, but we'll really start doing a push in 2024. So we would encourage folks follow the Kinsey Institute on social media, and once we're out, we'll have it available. We'll be doing some events and some speaking to share the science. I've got hundreds of articles in the book that really try and distill a lot of the work that's happening here at the Institute, and highlight the diversity and the beauty of the variation in our intimate lives.
Yeah, it is. It is. I suggest highly following them online. It is. I learn something constantly, all of the time when I read the Kinsey Institute posts. So definitely, and I think we've also got Desert Harvest aloe vera down here below. Definitely check us out and see how we're approaching sexual health through products and education as well. And that's why we partner with amazing institutions like the Kinsey Institute. Thank you so much, Dr. Garcia, for joining us today, for being on here, and for educating people on the Kinsey Institute, the amazing work that you do, and how they can support it through whether it's donating through Galabid, donating directly on the Kinsey Institute. Definitely, there are amazing items in the auction, and 100% of the proceeds is going to the Kinsey Institute. I think we've got the link there in the chat for you to directly go to. Check it out. And again, thank you, Dr. Garcia.
Thank you so much. Thanks for all of your support. Thanks to everyone supporting the Kinsey Institute and who's joined and been a part of the conversation, our many friends. And most importantly, thank you, Heather and Desert Harvest, for being our partners in the journey of exploring the unknown.
Thank you.